So welcome. This so in Israel, it's getting to be winter, and the part of Israel that we live in, it actually gets kind of cold, and it's supposed to be rainy this Shabbat. So I put in like a beachy kind of background just to amuse myself. Okay, so this week's parsha is Chayei Sarah. And this is the Torah portion where Sarah passes away, and Abraham finds not only a burial place for her, but also sends his servant Eliezer um, to find a wife for their son Yitzchak, Isaac. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to do the Haftarah, obviously, the summary. It is in Malachim Aleph, which is First Kings, chapter 1, verse 1 through 31. So all of tonight's class is going to be based on 31 verses in the first chapter of Malachim Aleph, which is First Kings. Okay, so let's start. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a summary of the what I divided these 31 verses into four acts. We're going to go more deeply into the character of two women that play a role in this. I'm going to talk about the parallels between the Haftarah and the Parsha, and then we'll get into a little bit of mystical stuff if we have time for that. Hopefully, we have time for that. Okay, so uh, First Kings, Malachim Aleph, chapter 1. In Act 1, King David is elderly. He's frail. He's actually 70 years old, which does not sound that old to me anymore. But he was only destined to live for 70 years. And so he's at the end of his life and he is unable to stay warm. There's um, an idea that the reason for that it has to do with something that happened earlier in his life, that when he had his predecessor, Shaul, King Saul, sort of cornered in a cave, he cut off a piece of his garment in order, his point was to prove you were this close to me and I didn't kill you. But because he sort of treated clothing in this the clothing of the king in this disrespectful way, so the rabbis say that clothing can no longer keep him warm. His body cannot stay warm. So his court, the people around him, they find a young woman whose name is Avishag, and they bring her to basically warm him and to keep him comfortable, like with body heat. And that sets the scene for the sort of palace drama, I'm going to call it, of the succession in the final days of King David. So that's Act 1. Avishag comes on this stage in order to warm the elderly King David. What's going on outside of uh, his bedroom is that his fourth son, I believe it's his fourth son, his oldest remaining son, because some of his sons are dead by now. He has a son named Adoniyahu. I don't know what you call him, but that's what I'm going to call him. That's what we call him. He was born after Avshalom, and he takes advantage of the fact that his father is weakened, and he declares himself king. And he gathers supporters, including David's general, whose name is Yoav, Evyatar, who's the high priest, and he hosts a feast in order to celebrate his supposed coronation as the next king. However, there are some key people missing from this fiesta. One of them is the prophet Natan, who you may know as Nathan. Another priest named Tzadok. There's a very close advisor to King David, but the main guy who's missing is Shlomo, Solomon. They are not invited to this party, and that is a revelation of Adoniyahu's plans, because Shlomo, Solomon, is the one that everybody expects to take over. Okay, here comes Act 3. So now we have a dangerous situation. We have uh, a dying king. We have a proud oldest son who's acting like the kingship is his, and we have people in the background, including the prophet Nathan, and Shlomo, Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, who understand that this is not a good scenario. And so they recognize there's danger here. And Natan the prophet acts quickly, and he says to Bathsheba, who is the mother of Shlomo, of King Solomon. Well, he's not king yet, but he's destined to be king, to go into the chamber where King David is on his deathbed, basically, and remind him of his oath, of his promise that her son Shlomo, who is, by the way, at this point about 12 years old, is going to succeed him as king. So Bathsheba enters the king's chambers. She, even though she is a wife and she's one of the favorite wives, she bows out of respect for the king. She reports to the king what's going on with Adoniyahu, that he's making this party and he's acting like he's the king to come. And this is what they worked out between them. While she's still speaking to him and bringing him up to date, the prophet Nathan arrives to confirm the report and to reinforce the fact that this is an urgent situation and that King David has to act. And so at the end of this Haftarah, this is just a brief skeletal outline. King David, in his last moments, reaffirms that Shlomo, that Solomon will be the next king. He acts decisively. He swears before God that it is his son Solomon, Shlomo, who is going to reign after him and sit upon his throne. And he calls Bathsheba back in the room. So the stage directions are sort of like this. Bathsheba goes in. She starts talking to him. Natan comes in. She slips out. When King David says, I'm going to take care of this, Bathsheba comes back. He calls her back into the room and he promises her that her son Solomon Shlomo will be crowned that very day, and in that way securing the peaceful transition of power. Okay, so what are some of the themes that we see in these 31 verses? Number one is the transition of leadership. This story marks politically the moment when the end of the reign of King David is there and the Davidic dynasty is passed to King Solomon, Shlomo. That's number one. Number two, faithfulness to his oath. David, even in his last moments, he's weak, he's frail, he's bedridden. His integrity is such that he fulfills his word, his promise to Bathsheba, to preserve the not only what he understands as God's intention for what happens to this nation, what happens to this people, but also that there should be moral order. So when you have a coup, like what Adoniyahu was trying to do, that's not a good sign for the nation because it's political unrest and all that. But in fact, um, out of his clarity and his decisiveness, even in his last moments, he preserves the um, he preserves the what's the word I'm looking for, the sanctity or the calmness of the nation. Also, there's a theme of relying on a prophet. So Natan, who was the prophet at that time, it's his idea to have this whole intervention with Bathsheba coming in and saying this, and then he comes in and he says that, and Natan is sort of orchestrating this in order to protect God's plan that Solomon become the next king from being derailed by this political stuff that Adoniah was trying to do. We also have a theme of the power of the woman because Bathsheba is a major player in this story and she acts with tact, she acts with bravery to ensure she's acting as a mother, but also not just a mother of Solomon, but also a mother of the nation because she wants the best transition in governance, and she knows that that is her wise son Solomon, and so she has a big role to play in that. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, and also the idea of God has dominion over politics. So even though there's human scheming going on in Adoniyahu's little party, the true heir that God chose is confirmed in this story. Now, I want to look a little bit more deeply into these two women characters, Avishag and Bathsheba. So so it says in First Kings, in Malachim Aleph, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 3. So they first talk about how David is old and he can't get warm. So they sought for the king a young virgin throughout all the borders of Israel. So the Midrash elaborates and says they gathered a whole bunch of young women. Each of them is brought to the king to test whether she has, I don't know, like enough body warmth to warm him. None of them were successful until Abishag shows up, and immediately she is successful and he is warmed. the Midrash is emphasizing that her selection is divinely guided. It the kind of the it should resonate in your head as the story of how Esther was chosen to be queen. That there were all of these people before, and when it's Esther's turn, then the decision is made. So it is a godly, divine choice that she ended up being the one there at the time. Her physical warmth, the rabbis say, is an external expression, a physical expression of her inner spiritual vitality. And she is called Abishag the Shunammite. Now, you may remember that last week we talked about the Shunammite woman in last week's Haftarah. She was the wealthy and prominent woman from Shunam who cared for Elisha the prophet. He promises her a baby. The son dies when he's young, and so on and so forth. You remember that? Hopefully, you remember that story. So these are the two times that women from Shunam are mentioned. And so there's a supposition that they are related, that in fact they are sisters. Shunem, by the way, it's not a city that exists in Israel anymore, but it was in the portion of Issachar. It's in the northeast of Israel. What else do we know about Abishag? We know that the Midrash praises her for being modest, that it says about her, she served him, that is King David, with great modesty and purity, and David treated her with honor. According to the Talmud, the 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 people who were looking out for King David at the end of his life specifically wanted a beautiful young woman because they thought that that might help restore his bodily warmth. But when they brought Abishag to him, the Talmud emphasizes that they were not intimate. Okay. And what's the reason for that? So there's a rule, a law, that a Jewish king cannot have more than 18 wives. And he had 18 wives. So even though we're taught that actually Abishag wanted to marry him or wanted him to marry her, he refrained. So there's both an aspect of this in Jewish law, but also an ethical or a personality quality in David that we can admire, that he's demonstrating self-control and loyalty to the Torah, even when he's tested in the presence of this young and beautiful attendant. Now, there are some commentaries that note that her name, Avishag, can be read. Avi in Hebrew means my father, and shag is a verb meaning strayed. So it's symbolically connecting her to some earlier moral failure that King David had, well, he wasn't a king yet, but that he had with Bathsheba. That the presence of Avishag at the end of his life represents a rectification, an opportunity for him to be in a similar situation where he's with a woman who really isn't permitted to him. And in the case of Bathsheba, he did not restrain himself, but now he does restrain himself. So once there was sin, and now there is the teshuvah, the repentance for that. There's also an opinion that Adoniyahu actually planned to use Avishag to discredit his own father by proving to the nation, I guess, that King David was as unable to control his passions at 70 as he was when he took Bathsheba when he was a much younger man. And in that way, he hoped that the people would turn their support away from David and Bathsheba and Shlomo, Solomon, and support him, Adoniyahu, instead. So she was something of, in his mind, something of a pawn. But the rabbis generally treat her as pure, as devoted, as loyal. In fact, there's a midrash that imagines a conversation between Abishag and David where she says to him, my lord, the king, I'm paraphrasing, please marry me. And he says it's forbidden because I already have reached the limit of the number of wives that are permitted to a king. And she says to him, then let your son Shlomo marry me, Solomon. And David says that too is forbidden because the Torah says that a son shall not uncover his father's garment. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1, if you want to look it up, but it's an allusion to Leviticus 18, which prohibits intimacy with the for is obviously directed to men, intimacy with the wife of your father. So there's such a dialogue, the rabbi said, didn't happen, but they're emphasizing David's piety, his restraint, and also we're not going to get to this, but in the next chapter, Adoniyahu, when Solomon becomes king, Adoniyahu asks Solomon, "Can I marry Abishag?" And that is actually seen as a rebellious act. So um, I want to tell you how the rabbis derive the idea that King David and Abishag were not uh, did not have sex, and that let's look at the first four verses. I'm just going to read them to you in a translation. King David was old. He came into his old age, and they covered him with clothes, but he was not warmed. This is the setup for bringing a woman into his bed. And his servants said to him, "Let them seek for my lord the king a young girl, a virgin, and she shall stand before the king, and she shall be to him a warmer, and she shall lie in your lap, and it shall be warm for my lord the king." And so they sought a beautiful young girl throughout the borders of Israel and found Avishag the Shunammite and brought her to the king. And the young girl was very beautiful, and she was a warmer to the king, and she ministered him. This is the key part. But the king did not know her. The phrase, the king did not know her, Hamelech lo yada, that's how you say it in Hebrew, is explicit. There's no sexual relationship between David and Abishag. And it's the same use of the verb to know as we saw with the Eitz Hadas Tov V'Ra, um, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's not just knowing like information, it's knowing in a sense of intimacy. So on a plain level, Avishag's role was therapeutic. His body could no longer generate heat. They suggest this ancient medieval medical, not medieval, this ancient medical practice using the warmth of another person's body to revive his circulation and his vitality. She was chosen for her youth and for her health, but her purpose was to care for him, not to sleep with him. And so the text that emphasizes her beauty is only emphasizing why she's chosen and then immediately clarifies that there's no intimacy between them. Um, I'm going to skip this part. Um, we will see later that the Midrash compares David's old age to that of Avraham in the Parsha. And basically, the idea is that both of these righteous men had reached the stage in life where, this is how the rabbis say it, the heat of this world no longer stirred them. Now, I don't want to get too graphic, but there is an opinion that King David was still physically capable of intimacy, but um, he was he wasn't driven by that the way that he was when he was a younger man. So she was just a, a functional, like a medical professional. Okay. So we talked about how Avraham was old in the Parsha, David is old in the Haftarah, and and they are both tested at the end of their days. Avraham is tested at the end of his life with the Akedah, with the binding of Isaac. And David is tested at the end of his life with this episode with Abishag. So Abishag's presence is a spiritual test demonstrating that his repentance for the sin that he had done with Bathsheba was complete, and he has now at 70 achieved full mastery over his physical desires. Um, later, later in Jewish history, commentators see Abishag as symbolizing not an individual woman and a man relationship, but um, the the loyalty of the entire nation of Israel that is still serving the aged king. That her warmth, which the text mentions, represents the life force of the nation of Israel, expressing loyalty to its leader, even though he's weak and old and he's going to die soon. And the purity that they ascribe to Avishag shows the purity of David's kingdom. It's being purified before Solomon is going to reign. The reign of Solomon is a very peaceful one. And you know from the book of Psalms and from everything that you know about the life of King David, he did not have an easy and peaceful life, but his son does. And he has a very important um, and peaceful reign before things devolve again. And actually, there's a tradition that I have heard, I didn't look it up and it only occurs to me now to share this with you, that during the days of King David, when things calmed down, and King Solomon, after, remember that the first temple was built during his reign, that lots and lots, I don't, thank you for not asking me how many, because I don't know, but lots and lots of people joined the nation of Israel at that time in history because they saw that God was with them. This was sort of a golden age of Israeli history. Okay. Um, there's there's also people, Jewish sources that interpret this story of Avishag and King David as a parable for this concept of leadership transition, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. Her warmth represents the warmth that the rabbis ascribe to Avishag represents that the old king has vitality, even though he's dying, he has vitality, and also that his restraint with her represents his spiritual discipline. His focus has shifted, as it does for many people, as they get closer to the end of their lives, from the physical life to their legacy. And her presence in the bedchamber of the king prepares the stage for Shlomo, for Solomon to succeed. And again, by not sleeping with her, David is demonstrating that earthly desires are no longer what's driving him. That's a little bit more about Abishag. Let's transition into Bathsheba. Who is Bathsheba? So I'm assuming you may call her Bathsheba. I don't know. That Bathsheba is one of the wives of King David and the mother of Solomon. And years earlier, she enters David's life under sort of tragic and morally complicated circumstances. At this point, she reappears as a grown woman who is strong, who is wise, who has moral clarity. She's no longer a passive figure as she was in the earlier story that we know about Bathsheba when she was basically seduced by King David, but she's a decisive actor in preserving the Davidic dynasty, and her transformation from a young woman who was kind of acted upon to, we're going to call her the queen mother who has agency, is itself a form of teshuva, of repentance, of spiritual repair, and a demonstration of the growth that she's experienced in her lifetime. And her story demonstrates that even people who have been marked by painful or misunderstood beginnings can still grow into more leadership, spiritual leadership, and so forth. So when she goes into the chamber, the bedchamber of the king to advocate for her own son, she's demonstrating a remarkable level of courage and composure because she's uninvited, but she's humble, she's intelligent, she speaks diplomatically, she reminds David of his oath without accusing him, without freaking out, without panic. Her words are calm, but very, I would say calculated, but not in the sense of like calculated, but strategic. She models how to speak the truth to power by using grace, by using careful timing, by being respectful. Now, Bathsheba is coordinating this with Natan HaNavi, with Nathan the prophet, and he represents divine authority because, of course, he is a prophet, and she listens to his counsel, and she follows out his plan precisely, and together they're able to protect God's will that it is Shlomo, Solomon, and not Adoniyahu who succeeds David. So she's acting as a bridge between human loyalty and divine intention. This episode of her in the bedchamber kind of marks the beginning of her new role because, of course, she lives on beyond the point of King David's death, and she is now the queen mother. She is the mother of the queen, which is a position of genuine power in the Davidic monarchy. Later, in the second chapter of First Kings, Shlomo, who is now the king, bows to her and seats her at his right hand. So she was once, as a young woman, summoned to the king's bed. Well, he wasn't the king. I think he wasn't the king at the time. I have to look that up. But she now sits to the right of the throne, which is an image that restores to her dignity um, and the idea that God has forgiven her for whatever her role was in that whole earlier episode. So rabbinic tradition often reads her story, her life playing out as a process of rectification for herself, for David, and for the kingdom. She's transcended her reputation as being a woman with whom a young David sinned, and the Midrash calls her at this stage of her life wise and understanding. She is the very picture of redemption and wisdom. In this way, she kind of reminds me of somebody we studied last year, whose name is Rahab. I think you call her Rahab, who was a prostitute for 40 years. And she ends up doing tshuva, repenting, and she marries Joshua. She marries Yehoshua. So there's some, even though I don't believe that Bathsheba ever gets married again, she's grown from a young woman caught in this moral storm of, because she remembered that she was married to somebody else, to now she's the queen mother and she's safeguarding God's promise over the nation. So it's one of the Tanakh's most remarkable examples of the spiritual evolution. And I'm going to skip that because I'll get to it later. Okay, let's talk about parallels to the Parsha. Okay, so the Parsha Chayei, you will find in Bereshit in the book of Genesis, chapter 23, verse 1 to 25:18. And the Haftarah I already told you was Melachim Aleph, 1 Kings, chapter 1, 1 through 31. Both passages, we alluded to this, describe transition at the end of a great leader's life. Avraham in the Parsha and David in the Haftarah, and both focus on ensuring that God's covenant is going to continue through the next generation. So we have a number of parallels. We have an aged patriarch, and we have a question of succession. So in the Parsha, excuse me a second. In the Parsha, we have Avraham Zakein, Baba Yamim, that Avraham is old in his days, and he's arranging now for his son Yitzchak's future to get married and to establish the next generation of the family. And we also have Hamelech David Zakein, Baba Yamim. So the same language referring to David in the first sentence that he now has to secure who's going to follow him on the throne. So both open with nearly identical phrases describing old age and signaling that there's this generational transition that's coming up. So the generational transition also requires choosing the right successor. So Abraham's servant Eliezer, it goes and he seeks out Rivka, you may call her Rebecca, to ensure that the covenant passes from Abraham through the proper child, the proper wife, which is Sarah, and the proper child, which is Yitzhak. By the way, there's a midrashic tradition that Eliezer wanted Abraham's son Yitzhak to marry his own daughter, Eliezer's daughter. Abraham did not agree to that. But after he turns him down, Eliezer faithfully carries out Abraham's wishes to find him a proper wife from within the family. Because remember, this is way before the Torah. There's no nation of Israel yet because this is a couple generations even before the 12 tribes are born, but there is a family. And Abraham wants his son Yitzchak, Abraham wants his son Isaac to marry a wife from the family. That's why Eliezer's daughter was not acceptable for this nation building exercise. So, and of course, as we've said, that David, through Bathsheba and Natan, confirms that Shlomo, not Adoniyahu, is going to inherit that kingship. So each story centers on preventing the wrong person from inheriting the mission and the survival of the divine plan. There, another parallel is that there's a key woman who safeguards the covenant. So in the Parsha, Rivka is decisively agrees to go with Eliezer and to marry this man that she has never met before. And in the Haftarah, Bathsheba's courage and her diplomacy are also decisive and also make it possible for her son to inherit the promise of David. So the rabbis say that there's a discernment that women have about what is the proper next thing to happen for the family. And it doesn't just happen to them. They both, Rivka, by agreeing, even though her brother and her father clearly don't want her to go initially, and Bathsheba, who is overriding what you might consider like the men are duking it out. Adoniyahu's having this party with all of these leaders, except for a few people that are very loyal to King David. And it seems like like a fight between men. And then Bathsheba steps on, and she becomes a crucial instrument of making the story play out the way it is, the way it has. We also have the theme of faithful servants who act on behalf of their masters. So in the Parsha, obviously, it's Eliezer, the servant of Abraham. And in the Haftarah, it's Natan, it's Nathan the prophet who acts swiftly to protect David and God's plan for the Davidic kingdom. And each of these two loyal emissaries have to use wisdom and moral courage to ensure that their master's will, which is an extension of God's plan for this nation, is upheld. So now we have God's promise of continuity. In the Parsha, the covenantal line that was promised to Abraham continues through Yitzhak, through Isaac, leading to the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. And in the Haftarah, Shlomo's coronation secures the Davidic dynasty, through which, of course, the messianic promise will later unfold, hopefully, as we say, swiftly in our day. So both narratives affirm that God has chosen how the uh, the covenant is going to continue. And even though there's some static on the line, uncertainty and human intrigue that might derail that, the God's promise of continuity is assured, and both the Parsha and the Haftarah end in peaceful revolution and a sense of closure for that stage. So the Parsha ends with Abraham's peaceful death and burial beside Sarah, and the Haftarah concludes with the restoration of order, because Shlomo is in fact designated as king, Adoniyahu's coup is thwarted, and David is reassured of his legacy. So both stories close with harmony, that harmony has been restored, the next generation is securely in place in a leadership position. So you see the parallel here, I hope. If I did my job, you can see the connection. Okay, let's look at some universal lessons that come out of these two stories, especially the Haftarah. One is the importance of righteous succession and continuity. So King David's final days highlight how, and I'm speaking, a lot of these, by the way, are in the ideal. We happen not to be living in an ideal political or historical time in terms of what's going on. But in its ideal, every generation has to secure its own moral and spiritual continuity. So David's dynasty is destined to carry God's light forward to the end of days. That's why we believe that the messianic ruler will be a physical descendant of King David. All people share responsibility to pass on wisdom and justice to the next generation. So those of us among us, and I think it's a lot of us, maybe not all of us, who have children or grandchildren, understand this concept of I can't. Oh well, what is his name? There's a a guy who wrote a whole theory about human development, and he talks about how the last stage, or towards the end of your life, you start being concerned about your legacy. You start being concerned about passing on the wisdom that you have acquired in life to the next generation. So that there's a universality of that. It's not just about King David. It's not just about Abraham. It's about all people. It's that ideally leadership, whether it's national leadership or family leadership, perhaps, and legacy in any society, in any organization, in any family grouping, it has to serve a higher value, not be about personal ambition. And that lesson is true for any of us that have basically that have people in our lives that are of the next generation or the generation after that. Okay. So that's the first one. The second one is moral courage and timely action. So Natan, the prophet Nathan, and Bathsheba, they act decisively in order to prevent Adoniyahu's coup, his illegitimate grab for power. And what they're teaching us is that silence in the face of wrongdoing is dangerous for truth. When so what's the universal principle? When injustice or confusion is threatening, that moral people have to act with integrity and urgency. And it does kind of make me think about, not I don't want to get too political, but what is the most obvious example of that right now? I think the most obvious example of that right now is the New York City mayoral race. And how are the New Yorkers going to react to with integrity and with urgency to fix this problem that is created. But there's a Jewish teaching that comes from Pirkei Avot, which is actually literally right now my husband is teaching I don't know if he's using it, but from this book, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. And here's the quote, and then I'm going to make it relevant for us. The quote is, "In a place where there are no men, you must strive to be a man." Now, obviously, none of us are men, and we are not striving to be men. But what is another way of translating that? In a place where no one is acting with moral strength, you be the one who does. When no one speaks up, you speak up. When no one acts kindly in a situation, you act kindly. When others are silent in the face of some wrongdoing, you show strength. See yourself as a moral leader, even or especially when no one else is taking the initiative. So, this is a call to us, all of us in our way, to take responsibility in moments of a moral or a communal vacuum in a family, in a classroom, in a community, in a public space. If no one is modeling faith, you model faith. If no one comforts those who are suffering, you go and comfort those who are suffering. If no one defends truth, you speak up. Moral leadership is not about gender, it's about a readiness to act. And I think this is especially relevant right now in in this time when anti-Semitism is flaring. And I know that in our WhatsApp group, some of you have spoken about this, that even though you may not be Jewish, you take this rise in anti-Semitism very personally. And this is what the Torah would say for you to find a place where you can assert a positive influence in the face of this. There's a more mystical in more mystical thought. The word for man is ish. The Hebrew word for man is ish, and that represents the attribute of what we call gevura, which is inner strength, discipline, and moral courage. So everybody, men and women, contain both masculine and feminine energy. And so we have the idea of strive to be an ish, which is sort of a rough translation of the Pirkei Avot that I said, means activate your inner strength, your boundaries, your sense of moral responsibility, even if others around you are remaining passive. That women can cultivate this spiritual masculine quality as part of becoming balanced and complete servants of God. That is regardless of whether you're male, regardless of whether you're female, regardless of whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, is a universal lesson from the Haftarah. Another one is loyalty and trustworthiness in relationships. So Bathsheba in her action is honoring both her husband's word and the prophetic mission for the Davidic dynasty. And the way she does it ensures that these promises are kept. So a healthy society is built on trust between individuals, between leaders, communities, and keeping one's word builds the foundation for a healthy society, for peace, for justice, and so forth. Um, we don't see a whole lot of that in the world, but hopefully, hopefully you see that at least in your family as its own society, its own little society. Another universal principle is the dignity of elders and the value of taking counsel from people who have something to offer you. So David is frail, but his wisdom remains vital. His advisors have continue to have respect for him, even though his body is failing. And that teaches that every generation benefits from the experience of those who came before. So what's the universal principle? Honor for those, honor for elders, receptivity to their guidance, also, as we age, seeing ourselves as a source of wisdom, seeing ourselves as somebody who has something to contribute to the next generation coming after us. Okay. Another universal principle from here is the fact that divine providence guides human events. So there's political maneuvering going on, but the ultimate outcome in this story, the coronation of Solomon, the coronation of Shlomo, that fulfills divine intention. So the principle here is that history is not random. God has many ways of making whatever his plan is happen. It might look like humans are running the unfolding of events in the world, and that is a deception that we are all likely to fall into when we pay very close attention to what's happening in the news and so forth. But as I have said 10,000 times to you, the universal principle here is that Hashem runs the world. It may look like it's people doing things, but it's really Hashem behind all of it. The um, the sixth and the seventh, these are the last two universal principles, the balance of prophecy and politics. So every society need so David is the king. He's the governance. But Natan is the voice of morality. Natan the prophet, Nathan the prophet, is the moral conscience of the Davidic dynasty. And so it David did not run his kingdom, and Solomon did not run his kingdom just based on politics, but they relied on spiritual and ethical voices that guided them toward righteousness and away from corruption. And I think we can plainly see today what happens when those kinds of leaders are missing in the world. And the last of the seven universal principles from this story is women as partners in divine history. So moral courage and wisdom are not limited by gender. Both men and women are called upon to shape this world into a more righteous place. And Bathsheba's example of how women serve essential roles in preserving truth and justice for the next generation. Okay, now I want to talk about some Kabbalistic ideas in this transition from King David to King Solomon, because it doesn't just represent a political succession, but there's a shift of divine energy going on. But in order to do that, I have to introduce you to a concept called the Sphirot. Now, you may have heard that word before. Maybe you know a little something about it. You don't know a little something about it. The Sphirot there's 10 of them, and they are 10 ways that God's light and energy flow into this world. They are not 10 different gods. They're not 10 different beings. They are like channels or qualities through which one God expresses himself in this world. So this is not an exact parallel, but so one way of thinking in the physical world, and then I'll give you a more personal example, is if sunlight passes through a prism, it's one light, but the prism breaks that light into many colors, and each color shows a different quality or a different side of the same light. Similarly, you may be a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a worker, a friend, an aunt, a daughter, I'm trying to think of three more. A friend, whatever, all of those things, but it's all still you. So similarly, Hashem's energy flows into the world through 10 different channels. Okay. And I don't know if I want to go into each of them, but there's these 10 and they are kind of on a ladder. So some of them are more elevated and some of them are closer to us in this world. Okay. And the Sphirot help us understand that God interacts with his creatures and his creation in many different ways with different aspects of his personality. I don't know another way of saying that, but different aspects of, like, for example, God interacts with us sometimes with love and justice and beauty and truth and so forth, but also God sometimes interacts with us um, with setting limits or imposing discipline or justice or judgment. Okay. So the Sphirot show us how one infinite God can shine his light into a complex world, and it's all the same being. It's all the same divine being. So the transition from King David to King Solomon, Kabbalistically speaking, represents a transition from one sphera to another. Okay, because think of King David's life. His life was full of conflict, disrupted by many enemies, many kinds of battles, and so forth. And he has a lot of struggle in his life. Along comes his son Solomon, Shlomo, whose name comes from Shalom. Shlomo, Shalom, you can hear meaning peace. It corresponds to a different sphere that represents harmony, that represents wisdom, that represents divine peace. So their transition from the kingship of David to the kingship of Solomon represents also a cosmic shift from striving, because a lot of King David's life was about striving, to actually receiving. King David's life was one of constant struggle, and King Solomon was blessed with a largely peaceful life and a largely peaceful reign. Now, on top of that, Kabbalistically, Bathsheba represents the Shekhinah. What is the Shekhinah? Very difficult to define, but it is the closest manifestation of the divine presence that we have in our world. And her reappearance before her husband, just before he passes, symbolizes the idea that the Shekhinah wants to be rejoined with her source. What is her source? God Himself. So when David reaffirms her son Solomon's right to kingship, that signifies on a mystical level the restoration of harmony between the masculine and feminine aspects of divinity, between God and the Shekhinah, between David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba's advocacy before David for her son to take the throne, it's not merely political, it's an act of cosmic rectification, fixing something in the divine order, getting the world ready for the next stage. There's also this idea of the rebellion, Adoniyahu's rebellion of this other son. So there's a Kabbalistic understanding of this as well, that to which I have to introduce you to the concept of klipot. I probably have spoken about this before, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more detail here. The word klipa in Hebrew literally means a shell or a peel. So let's say that I'm at the shuk and I want to buy peanuts. And I want to buy peanuts either in the shell or that have already been shelled, that have already been removed from the shell. I will, peanuts in Hebrew is botnim. So I will ask for botnim im klipot, botnim with the shell, or botnim without the shell. Okay. So it's a modern Hebrew word, but it's also a very deep spiritual concept. Klipot are spiritual shells or peels or something that cover or hide holy things. So a fruit has an outer peel that protects it, but it also hides what's inside, like banana skin. Okay, you can look at the klipa of a banana because you know that's the part you peel off and you throw away to get to the good stuff. So the good stuff is the holiness that is inside, but the banana peel is like the klipa that conceals the good stuff. So klipot are the layers that conceal God's light in this world. Klipot are not evil beings. Um, they're not, they represent the forces of concealment and spiritual blockage. So, for example, there's an idea that when a Jewish person eats non-kosher food, that they create in themselves, and I don't think this applies to people for whom eating non-kosher food is not forbidden, but for a Jew, they create a kind of spiritual blockage for themselves by eating foods that are not, this is a sort of a marriage between the physical and the spiritual, that they eat something that they ought not be eating, that it results in a spiritual blockage. It might also, like if it's a really unhealthy food, it might be like a physical blockage, the way we understand people who have heart attacks and stuff. But um, a klipa is a force that conceals something holy. Okay. So if people act selfishly, cruelly, if they are not motivated by holy things, they feed the klipot. The covering gets thicker. It's harder to see God's goodness in a world like that. But when people act with kindness, when they express gratitude, when they express faith, then they are piercing the klipa and more divine light can shine into this world. Okay. So our job is to look past the outer klipa, the outer shell, to see the holiness inside everything and to use it for good. And also not to confuse the klipa, the shell, for the real thing. So this is, I think, a useful lesson when we are dealing with what's going on in the world, is to understand, this is one of the ways that I understand it. And I think it was Vicky, somebody this week reminded me about a lesson that I taught last year about the spiritual significance of anti-Semitism. I don't remember how I said it, but like anti-Semitism isn't like any other kind of hatred. It isn't like any other kind of racism. It isn't like any other kind of um, prejudice in the world. It has spiritual layers to it, and we spoke about this last year. If you're interested, let me know, and I'll send the link out, and you can watch it again. Or for those of you that are new, you can watch it for the first time. But it's important not to confuse the klipa, the shell, for the real thing. So you have to see what's going on in the world today and look beyond the external. Now, God created klipot so that we can choose to uncover the light, to focus on the holy, to connect to God without darkness, without it being hard. There would be no free will. There would be no chance to grow because there's nothing to work against. And every act of goodness that we do, every act of gratitude, every act of faith, every act of kindness thins that shell and removes a bit more of God's light in the world. So I just want to tell you this story. So there's this weird thing in Israel where if you order something online, it very rarely comes to your front door. Usually it goes to a store, and then you have to go to that store to go pick it up. And the store makes a few shekels on it, and I guess if they distribute enough packages, they can make a few thousand shekels, whatever. So I ordered a birthday present for my grandson who turned 8 this week, and I got a message yesterday that the package was waiting for me, not in Efrat where I live, but in Jerusalem. In order to get to this package, I would have to get on a bus and possibly get on a train and take a half a day to go into Jerusalem to go pick up this package. So I went a little ballistic. And I was talking it over with somebody this morning, one of my study partners, and I remembered that I live in a country where people like to do kindness for each other. And so I posted and I asked, was anybody going to be in this center of Jerusalem? Like maybe they were going to be there anyway. I'm not asking anybody to go separately for me. And maybe they could pick up this package for me. So in fact, I found somebody who works in Jerusalem and takes the bus. And he went and picked up this package. And after class, my husband's going to his house to go pick up this package. So that would be an example of an an act of goodness in the world that helps to reveal a bit more of God's light. Okay, that's the way God wants us to be with each other. Not to say, tough luck, Charlie, your package is in Jerusalem. It's, you got to figure out how to get it. But what can we do for each other? What can we do to bring more goodness into the world? And I'll just finish with this idea and then I'll open it up for your questions. The ultimate mystical message is that the reign of King Solomon represents the messianic prototype when all of the divine attributes, all of the Sefirot are harmonized, there's no more war, the Shekhinah is resting fully among humanity. These are the promises of the reign of the man we call Mashiach ben David, Messiah, son of David, who is a descendant of David. So the spiritual journey from David to Solomon parallels this cosmic journey from chaos to harmony, from fragmentation to unity, and from exile to redemption. And now I am going to change my view so that I can oops, so that I can see you guys. Okay. We have 6 minutes together. Anybody have a reaction, a question, a comment? Anything that wasn't clear?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, you mentioned Natan being that wisdom for King David. So, for the Jewish people, do they see prophecy as like it's not happening anymore? And will it begin to start happening once again as we get closer to redemption?
That's a great
So,
question.
if you could just talk a little bit about that, because
Yeah,
I find that
I would love to.
fascinating.
Yes. Okay, so in the books of prophets of the Bible, okay, there were many prophets and many schools of prophecy, but not everybody who had prophecy had a prophecy that was going to be relevant for all time. And so the books of prophets are only the recordings of the prophets that had something to say that would be relevant for the future. Okay, so if I have a prophecy, I don't know, let's say I have a prophecy that you should not go in your car tomorrow because you're if you go to your car tomorrow, there's going to be an accident and whatever. That's important for you to know, but it's not something that's going to lead you like till the end of days. Okay. So the only prophecies that are recorded in our tradition are the ones that would be relevant for all time. There was a time when the drive to worship idols was so strong that very spiritual people had a hard time not doing it. And so the rabbis prayed that God should take away this desire for idol worship. And God said, I will take it out of the world, but I will also take prophecy because otherwise there has to be balance. Okay. So there's a um, prophecy is sort of like on the plus side, and the Yetzer Hara, the desire to worship idols, is on the minus side, and that balances. If I'm going to take away one, I'm going to take away the other. Okay. But exactly what you said is true. And that is that there is a promise that as we get closer to the end of days, that prophecy will return to the world. And some people say that that has begun to happen. I
Mhm.
can't say that the Jewish people have like clearly identified such and such a personality as a modern day prophet, but you can see, I think, in the world that there are some people whose vision is very big and who are guiding the nation in a good way, in a holy way towards that. And so I don't know if it's going to be like everybody's going to have prophecy the way it was back in biblical times or only certain people. I don't know the answer to that, but exactly what you conjecture is true. That prophecy will return to the world. And some people say is already beginning to return, even if it's not completely obvious to us yet. Anything else?
Yeah.
Anybody else comment, question? Nothing?
Is there a
Okay.
difference?
Oh,
Can
good.
you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Is there a difference between the I don't know how to say it, the klipa and the evil inclination?
You said it correctly, klipa. Yes, they are, I would say they are both tools of God. So God runs everything. He introduces, we talked about this last week or the week before when I talked about 2 weeks ago, was it? Okay. When I talked about the evil inclination also operating as the Satan, also operating as the angel of death, and it's all the same force, that force works for God. And the klipa serves a similar purpose in making it so that we have to actively overcome being, this may not be quite the right word, but like being seduced by the darkness, not to fall into that, not to give up our um faith, and not to think like the bad guys are running the show and what happened to Hashem and all that. Not to fall into that. So the klipa is again a tool that God uses to help us sharpen our faith and earn reward. So I would say they're in the same, they're like cousins. They're like in the same family, but they're not exactly the same thing. That is how I understand it. Great question.
Um, I was wondering if you can kind of compare maybe, I'm not sure if the right word, but the Shekhinah and the Ruach. Like maybe I'm a little confused on those.
Okay. Um, so ruach literally means wind and I have heard Christians or people coming from a Christian background use the word ruach in a way that I don't hear Jews using it. Okay. So I'm not 100% sure what somebody means when they say that because I don't know Jews to use. That doesn't mean they don't. I'm saying in my experience, I don't know what exactly that means. I always thought it meant like sort of Hebraicizing, the concept of like Abba, Ben, and Ruach, like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, whatever. So I would have to understand more what you mean by Ruach exactly before I could answer that question. I don't know what that means. So I don't.
Okay. Well,
I don't know if
tell me
I can
about
answer that question.
Shekhinah.
Um, so the Shekhinah is very, you guys go like right to the heart of the deepest, deepest stuff. It's very hard to identify, but there's an idea, just like there are 10 sefirot and God expresses himself, like the light of God is so powerful that if it came directly into this world, it would just like blow up the world. Like we're not vessels to contain the power of the light of God. So the sefirot, the word I want to use is diminish, but I don't mean it like they reduce the light of God to a point where we in the lower physical world can access it at all. Okay. So it's kind of like if you took a fire hose, if I took a fire hose at full power, because I mean to put out a house fire, and I pointed it to you, you would, I don't know if you would die from it, you would certainly like fall over, right? As opposed to if I just took like some water and I sprinkled it on you, right? You could handle that. So that would be an example, a physical example of the reduction of it's still water coming at you, but not at a force that you can't handle. Okay. So so the sphere that's the spherot. The Shechina is that's actually a very I have to remember that. That's a very good example. But anyway, the or analogy, the Shechina is just like God has levels, God also has feminine dimension and a masculine dimension. And the Shekhinah is always associated. It's not the same as like God being a woman. I think some people misunderstand that, or it's not like that. It's not anything separate from God, but it is one of the ways that God manifests in this world. So for example, there is a teaching that when the Jews go into exile, that God sends the Shekhinah, however you understand this, because I'm not saying that I fully understand it either, because it's a very esoteric concept, but God sends part of his self. It's weird to say that, but in order to protect the Jewish people in exile. And actually, one of the surest signs that the exile is coming to an end, because exiles are meant to be finite and they serve a specific purpose. And then when they are over, things get tough for the Jews in whatever exile that is. So right now, let's use America as an example. That's a great example.
Mhm.
For hundreds of years, America was a haven for Jewish people, and now it's becoming quite the opposite of that. Okay. So our teaching would say, well, the Shekhinah is beginning to withdraw its protection, and anti-Semitism, which is the natural order of things, pops up because there's no dome of the Shekhinah protecting the Jewish people there, and that is a sign.
Mhm.
It's a spiritual sign. That's the mechanism by which God says, "Move on out. It's time. Time's over." Um, but the Shekhinah does have. It is like we're everything, all of us, all of these dimensions. And I study with this woman who is really a scholar, and she's older than me, and she's been religious her whole life, and she she writes words of Torah, whatever, whatever. And I said to her, can you please explain to me the Shekhinah? And she said, I don't think I can. Like it's not a simple thing, but we know that it's one of the tools that God uses to interact with his world. And it has a feminine dimension. That's really all I can say about that. Okay. Helen, you want to say something or you?
No, no, sorry.
Okay. All
Well,
right.
actually, I have a
Okay.
question, but is it too,
Go
I
ahead.
don't
I'll
want to
take one
keep you.
more.
Maybe.
I'll take
Okay,
yours.
so you mentioned about Moshiach being a son of Joseph and a son of David. Does that mean he's a descendant or he carries the attributes of these men?
Okay. So the just for those of you that are not quite clear what she just asked, there's a tradition that there are two messianic personalities, the Mashiach ben Yosef, who is a physical descendant of Yosef, and Mashiach ben David, who is a physical descendant of David. This is one of the classic answers to why Jews don't believe that Jesus is the messianic figure that we're waiting for, because he doesn't have the right ancestry. But that's just by side. But they also share elements of the soul of the original person, and elements of the qualities of the original person that they are based on. So like for example, Joseph, in his role as Joseph, like the original biblical Joseph, he prepared um, he prepared the world to survive in a famine, right? And we understand that the Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah, son of Joseph, is also a preparatory Mashiach. He's very involved in the natural order of things. Mashiach ben David, who comes later in history, David came later than Joseph in biblical history, but also that Messiah comes later in history, is the physical descendant of King David, but also, David lived in a time of relative peace and prosperity in the land of Israel later in his life when his kingdom was firmly established. Um, and so they say that there are people all through history that have a piece of the soul. We've talked about reincarnation a number of times, that have a piece of the soul. There's like a potential messianic figure, messianic redeemer in every generation, depends on if the generation is worthy. And so I don't know, I'm talk all over the place. I hope that answers your question. That answer your question, Helen?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
thank you, thank you.
Okay. It occurred to me that I forgot to shut off the recording before we started our Q&A. So this will all be part of it. Okay. So that's it. That's today's lesson. And I'm happy to hear from you on the WhatsApp group if you have other questions. Thank you for joining. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye.